bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday. Sitting in today for Michael Novogradac, here's your host, Brad Elphick.
Hello, I'm Brad Elphick, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the December 3rd, 2024 edition. I'm honored to be sitting in today for Mike Novogradac. Don't worry, he will be back next week. But today's podcast will focus on an area of particular interest for me and my guests. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see that I'm joined by Rebecca Darling, partner of mine in Novogradac's Atlanta office. Rebecca and I both work in a variety of areas, but our particular focus and the focus of today's podcast is new markets tax credits. On November 19th, the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, or CDFI fund, opened the calendar year 2024 and 2025 new markets tax credit allocation round. This is the final round that was authorized by year-end legislation in 2020 that extended the new markets tax credit for 5 years. What's special about this round is that combined it involves a record $10 billion in allocation authority. That is $3 billion more than any round in history, and is why I'm so excited to discuss it today with Rebecca. This past summer, the CDFI fund announced that it would combine the calendar year 24 and 2025 rounds. This gives the CDFI fund time to possibly announce the awards by the end of 2025. In fact, their website currently says fall of 2025. It's been 8 years since awards have been announced in the year for which they were authorized. So that's good news. 2016 also happens to be the last time we had a combined allocation round. Rebecca and I will discuss some of the implications of a $10 billion round, including how many more awards we expect and how much larger some awards may be in today's podcast. We'll start our discussion with an overview of what exactly is included in the application. Then we'll take a look at some of the deadlines announced by the CDFI fund. After that, we'll take some time to look at what's new and different with this application compared to previous versions. Then we'll talk about what community development entities, or CDEs, and the businesses interested in obtaining new markets tax credit financing should be doing now. There's a lot to talk about, and this is an important issue in the new markets tax credit world. So if you're ready, let's get started. Rebecca, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday.
Thank you, Brad. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I see this is your 8th appearance on the podcast, but it is the first time with me as the host, so I'm glad that you're here as well.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, so we have a lot to talk about. A $10 billion round, that's pretty exciting. I shared a lot of the details of that $10 billion round, but there's a lot more for us to talk about. But there are probably some members of our audience who may not be as familiar with the process as you and I are. So maybe in an effort to level set, can you tell us a little bit about the application process? And I'll ask you to be somewhat brief, although it's easy for both you and I to kind of just go on and on about this, but I know that you're going to be going into greater detail in a webinar on December 11th, which is exciting. And we'll put a link to register for that webinar in today's show notes. But why don't you go ahead and share what's involved in the application and maybe when a CDE should start the process.
Sure, absolutely. So the allocation application is a robust, substantial application, like whatever, synonyms you can include. They're like, that's what you need to go ahead and mentally prepare yourself for. So this application, it requires hundreds of hours to complete. And I think even a lot of CDEs think about their application all year round, how deals that they get done are going to affect their application. So if you look at the application that the fund published, you'll see it's 142 pages. There are 45 questions, many of which have multiple subsidiary kind of questions in there. And then there's also 5 exhibits, which include multiple tables for each exhibit. So definitely a lot of different content to consider. I think the other thing to think about is it's very heavily narrative focused. So keep in mind, there's going to be a lot of narratives, and there are also character limits for each of those responses. And that includes spaces and punctuation. So you can't get away with that. So those are all things that you need to think about. Also keep in mind the fund published the application on their website, but CDEs have to enter their application into the online system that the CDFI fund has. It's called AMIS, Awards Management Information System, by the deadline. The last thing I really want to touch on is what comprises the application. So there are 6 parts. So we have applicant information, business strategy, community outcomes, management capacity, capitalization strategy, and prior awards. So business strategy and community outcomes are definitely, I think, where most folks spend the most of their time and efforts, just because of how the applications are reviewed and scored. So maybe I'll kind of pause there, Brad, and you can talk a little bit about how the applications are scored.
Yeah, I think it's it's always interesting, and a little bit about the application process is that we don't have a score sheet. For those that may be familiar with other competitive applications, you may know how each section is scored in terms of this question is worth this many points and so forth. Well, we don't have that insight into the application, but we do know that in the 2 sections that are scored, that there's each reviewer, and there's 2 reviewers in the scoring process. So the CDFI fund hires these outside reviewers. They come in and review each application and score the first 2 sections, as Rebecca mentioned, business strategy and community outcome section. And they're allowed to give each of those 2 sections 25 points each. And then there's also 10 bonus. So between uh, the 2 sections of the application and the 2 reviewers, 50 points for each reviewer. So that's 100 points combined. And then you have 10 bonus points each. So 20 more points. So you have 120 possible points. However, when the CDFI fund is looking at your score, they're going to combine those 2 reviewer scores for each section. And you have to get at least a 40 combined score of each section. However, when you take 40 and 40, that gets you 80. Their actual next threshold is 85 points. So you actually have to get a minimum of 85 points between the 2 sections in order to be considered a highly qualified application. And then they're going to take half of the total bonus points between those 2 reviewers. So in actuality, the total possible score that an applicant can receive is 110 points. And what's somewhat, I guess, somewhat of a barrier to entry or a high hurdle for being successful in this application round is that we see a large amount of applicants get very close to a perfect score. And when we get information after awards are given, we can see just how compressed the scoring is. So Rebecca mentioned spending hundreds of hours on these applications. You can tell that by how compressed the scoring is. So when you think about 110 points, and you're trying to figure out, you're going to go through your application. Rebecca, I know you do this with your client. Where can we squeeze, another portion of a point out of a response? And so when you're looking at it, that's how you should look at how it's scored.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that we have seen this continued compression of the scores, that the industry continues to present stronger and stronger applications. And so when the CDFI fund makes award announcements for those applicants that don't receive an award, they get what's called a debriefing letter. And at the bottom, they show kind of the general scoring of applications and the different ranges. And so pretty much everybody that's receiving an award isn't losing more than 2 points. And then the bottom end of the score is 100 or less. So you can have a highly qualified application, as you said, at least 85 points, and you're not even close to getting an award. So it really is, every fraction of a point matters.
Yeah, and I know we'll talk about this soon, but I think that that's what's exciting too about it being a combined round is that there's likely to be more awards, and we'll get into that. But I appreciate you pointing out just how compressed and how important that is to get those more, try to squeeze out those points. Um, so why don't we move on? There's a little, that's a little bit about the application and how it's scored. The CFI fund also obviously released a series of deadlines, and the big one is that the applications are due by 5 p.m. Eastern on January 29th. But there are other important deadlines before and after that. Could you take us through some of what those are?
Sure, absolutely. So we saw the application was released on November 19th. Um, if you are a CDE and you need to modify your service area, or you need to create subsidiary CDEs in order to meet your QUILICI and QEI threshold, the deadline is today. The day our of recording is posting, so December 3rd. The next really big deadline is the registration to apply. So this is this coming Thursday, December 5th. So if you're interested in applying in this round, you have to go into Amos and tell the fund that you plan on applying. Now, if you end up deciding after that that you're not going to apply, you're not required. But if you don't register, then you're ineligible. There is no fix there. But that's a very quick and easy process. Then I think the next really important date is the last day to ask the CDFI fund any questions is January 27th. So 2 days before the application is due. And pro tip here, don't send random emails to someone in the CDFI fund. Send service requests. That's their preferred method. And it also documents if there's an issue, it's documented on both your end and their end, which is really important. And then clearly the day we're all working towards at this point is the application deadline of Wednesday, January 29th. And then the last, I think, really key deadline is what we call the QEI and QUILICI issuance deadline. So that's going to be April 17th of 2025. So this deadline is only applicable to those applicants that have received allocation in the past. So in order to receive allocation in this current round, the fund wants to make sure that you're actually deploying your existing allocation. You can find those percentages in the NOAA, but maybe Brad, you want to touch on kind of what this threshold is a little bit for folks that aren't familiar.
Yeah, I know. And this, for those that kind of received allocations in the past, are obviously very familiar with this deadline and have worked to meet the threshold that Rebecca mentioned related to this deadline. So essentially what the CDFI fund is ensuring is that if you've received allocation previously, that you're getting a certain amount or a certain percentage of your allocation out by this deadline before they even consider you eligible for more allocation. And so what's important to remember, if you maybe just received your first award from the 2023 round, is that this is an eligibility requirement. And so you do have to meet these thresholds in order to be considered to have your application even reviewed. And so, as Rebecca mentioned, you have to close a certain percentage of your prior awards by April 17th. And as she mentioned, in the notice of allocation availability, they have a table in there. It's table 2 that lists what percentage of each award by round has to be not only issued, but also invested. And so this was a change this year. In prior years, the prior round had to have at least 20% invested. And this year it's 10%. And part of that is due to some, efforts within the industry, within the New Market Tax Credit Working Group, which I and Rebecca and others are involved with. We really were pushing to have that requirement reduced for most recent awardees, just because of the burden it pushes to not only close transactions, but reapply. And so I think, having it reduced from 20 to 10% may provide some relief. We'll see. This will be the first time it's been different. But it's important to go ahead and check what those other percentages are, because they also changed. And so we'll include links to all of the documents that the CFI fund provided in our show notes, and you can go and see what those new percentages are. So the other aspect of it that is important, I think, to remember too, Rebecca, is not only do you have to close them by April 17th, but you have to report them to the CDFI fund by April 24th, the week after. So I have heard horror stories of where applicants, they rushed and got their transaction closed by that April 17th deadline. However, they forgot or didn't report their transactions, their QEIs to the CDFI fund by the second deadline, which this round will be April 24th. And so because of that, they did all the hard work. But however, because they missed that reporting deadline, they weren't eligible in that next round. So just keep an eye on that. If you do have allocation and you are trying to meet your threshold, QEI threshold requirement, that you meet that reporting deadline as well.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Rebecca. And, as always, we'll include a lot of this in our show notes. So be sure to check that out afterwards as well. But Rebecca, there are some items in this application and that are new or different in addition to these changes in the percentages for the QEI and Quilliggy issuance requirements. And we've been able to kind of get a preview of what most of those changes are this year, because this year the CDFI fund had to put out the application template for public comment. And they put that out back in February, went through 2 rounds of comments. So we really did get a good sense of what those changes were likely to be. However, not everyone has been involved in reviewing those changes like you and I have. So could you maybe give us a little bit of insight about what some of those main changes were and why they're important?
Sure. So I think the first one is when you're hearing my deadlines, there was one deadline that you didn't hear, and that was when CDEs needed to be submitting their, CDE applications if they wanted to apply. So starting in this round, CDEs must be certified before the opening of the round, not just submitting those applications. And so the fund at least had published that information clearly in advance. And so I know of a lot of entities that wanted to become CDEs. So they were getting those applications in, and the fund had said, submit those by mid-October so that there's time for those to be reviewed before the round opened. I think the most,
And you're right. If you're listening to this podcast and you aren't a CDE yet, you won't be able to apply this $10 billion round, unfortunately. And that's a change this year. Is that right?
yeah, that's exactly right. And I think there are some that when you look at becoming a CDE and look at applying, there are many entities that this is a multi-year process. You have to really think through this whole application. It's, as we kind of said, it's not what you knock out in a long weekend and say, okay, we're done. So you do have to spend that time. Same thing with registering. If you don't register, that's just the cliff test. You're stopped. So hopefully by this point, you're hearing it, you've already applied, gotten your CDE certification, and you're ready to get going. I think the biggest change, what everybody has really talked about the most, is what a lot of us refer as the deep distress question, or question 25B. So the CDFI fund identified 4 areas in which applicants can make an additional commitment of their allocation. So those areas are deep distress, new market tax credit eligible native areas, high migration rural counties, and then U.S. island areas. So what does deep distress mean? So this essentially takes the definition of severely distressed and takes it a step further. So poverty rates greater than 40%, or area median family income less than 40%, or unemployment rates at least 2.5 times the national average. To put it in perspective, if you look at all the census tracts in the country, the deep distress census tracts are only about like 8%. So it's definitely like, those are going to be few and far between. Kind of the same thing for the high migration rural counties. There's only 168. So you're really talking about pretty, isolated numbers. But depending on your service area and your pipeline, this may align with where you're already serving. You may have a track record and so forth. So in this question, the CDFI fund asks applicants if they're going to commit to 0%, 5%, 10%, 15%, or 20% or more. And this is a graded question, and they very clearly say, the more you commit to, the higher score that you're going to receive. And so it's my opinion that in order to maximize your potential points in this question, you would need to select that 20% or more category. However, I just don't think every applicant can really do that. I think it really is something that you as a CDE need to look at and determine, what's your service area? What does your pipeline look like? What's your track record look like? And is this a realistic um, commitment that you can make?
Yeah, I've been talking to applicants that have received awards in the past, and all of them have, I think, gone back and looked at their track record of prior new market tax credit awards and have mapped to see how much of them would be in these deep distress census tracts. And
Yeah.
I think if you go to the Novogradac website and go to our new market tax credit mapping tool, when we saw this being previewed in during the public comment period, it seemed pretty evident that the CDFI fund was going down this path of trying to incentivize CDEs to make investments in even in areas of deeper distress, whether in one of these four categories that you mentioned. And so we've added a the ability for you to map whether or not something is in a deep distress census tract, and we use the color purple. I keep saying that, it's in homage to, the pan deep purple, but that's probably not really true. It's just, fit in the color scheme, I guess. But, it does highlight when you look at that map of how few areas actually meet that requirement. However, to your point, I agree. I think that because we talked about before, applicants have to chase every single point in this process, right? And CDFI fund says you will score more favorably if you do this. I really do feel like unless your service area has no deep distress or less than 20%, I think most, if not all applicants, uh, will probably check that 20% or more box. Can you talk about what else it says if you check the 20% box in terms of, you know, you can possibly get more allocation?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, right? So you got the different categories, right? From 0 to 20% that you could select. And then it says, okay, if you're selecting 20% or more, tell us what percentage you're willing to commit to, which is kind of similar to the non metro question, the innovative uses. And so here is an opportunity for you to say, I'm willing to commit up to X percentage that is clearly 20% or more. And this is an opportunity now to receive additional allocation. So, where the first part of the question was talking more about points and how to score, now you have the potential to get additional allocation. And so, I think CDEs, just like with those other questions, they're thinking about that and saying, all right, does this really make sense? And also, you have to think about you can't have what, Brad and I kind of refer to as a golden unicorn project. It can't check every single box, and that's the only way you're going to be able to deploy your allocation. You don't want to commit yourself to a point that you can't actually deploy. But I think that was something I was happy to see. Um, at least it balances it out. And I also agree with you over, the summer and fall, a lot of my clients were going back and looking at their track record to see, does their track record and pipeline align? We talk about that a lot throughout the application. And so one of the new questions to the application is question 25C, where applicants will talk about their track record of serving these four areas. But what's interesting is that was one of the areas that changed from the latest draft to the final version. The fund said, but we're not going to score this question. So I think that's great for CDEs that maybe had a lower track record of serving these areas, but have a pipeline in a service area that would support a higher commitment. Now you don't have that, concern that you might lose points from your track record not aligning pipeline.
Yeah, I think some of the, we talked about how you mentioned how this was one of the most highly talked about changes to the application. And I think some of the controversy around it is the fact that it's scored. So if you're in a service area, for example, that doesn't have any of these four attributes to it, which some CDEs have smaller service areas, right? And you may not have any deep distress. You may not be an island. You may not be a native area, and you may not be a high migration rural county. So I think the controversy there was you're automatically at a disadvantage and you're not able to maximize points. And so there were some recommendations that we made as part of the working group to say, maybe instead of scoring it, you make it more like an innovative use, right? And so I think that that's where some of the concern is that you're putting automatically some CDs at a disadvantage, and then two, now you're going to potentially incentivize CDEs to all chase a limited number of transactions in these areas. And so, I think time will tell in terms of, what the outcomes will look like in terms of the CDFI funds desire to kind of push CDs to invest in even more deep distressed areas, just like they did when they did severely distressed. Severely distressed was the bar before, and that was a higher bar than what the minimum requirement is just for new market tax credits. And so it's just another, example, I guess, of the CFI fund really saying, okay, y'all been doing this so well. Can you go even further into these communities and put these dollars to work? So, I'm excited to see what the industry comes up with because, it's a very creative industry. And every time the bar has been raised, I think it's been met. So, it'll be interesting to see how it turns out. What are some other changes you're seeing in the application?
Yeah, I think one that was interesting was the definition of disadvantaged business was changed. So before there were separate definitions for disadvantaged business and disadvantaged community. So disadvantaged business was a business that was A, located in a low income community, B, low income, person owned or controlled, or C, a business that has inadequate access to investment capital. And then disadvantaged business was basically it's a loan. That's it. Well, now they've combined the definition. So now it's disadvantaged business or not and disadvantaged community. So DBCs. So anyone that's worked in, applications in the past know that terminology, but I think it's important to point out it does say or. So disadvantaged community, same definition, but now for disadvantaged business, it's a 4-part definition. So first, a business that's located in persistent poverty area or new market tax credit eligible native area or U.S. island area. 2, a business that is low income person under control. But then it switches and says 3, for a for-profit business, less than $1 million or $1 million or less of annual revenues in the year leading up to the date of the Kuliki. And then 4, for a nonprofit business that it needs to predominantly serve low-income community residents or low-income persons. So I think for the most part, kind of to your point, Brad, most of my clients, when they look at their track record, they're not only serving low-income communities, they're serving very distressed communities. So most are already meeting that severely distressed criteria. However, I think if you're a CDE where you are relying on that, section C of the disadvantaged business definition of inadequate access to investment capital, and that business wasn't in a low income community, I think that is where really it can be problematic. So I think a lot of CDEs are really looking at their potential investments just to make sure that the business is meeting the definition. And of course, certainly is located in a low income community. So I think that's really critical as you're evaluating your track record pipeline.
And what part of the application is this impacting? And
Sure. So it impacts a couple different things, but our 2 favorite sections, right? Business strategy and community outcomes. That's where it's really hitting. So especially when you look at your pipeline, but then also I think one of the questions that you and I looked at was for track record, right? Are we using the old definition when you're filling out your track record table or you're using the new definition. And so it's things like that where we really go through every word of the application to make sure that we complete the application correctly. And so that's a question I think us as a Novogradac working group will be asking the fund. They're going to be hosting a webinar and you can submit questions in advance. So that's one of our questions is just trying to make sure that as we're providing guidance to our CDE clients that they're completing these tables correctly.
And the question being if the definition is retroactive or prospective, right? Because I think that, part of the concern is that the definition applies to your track record. And so now if you have to go back, you've been putting in your application all these years, meeting, you know, a number of businesses that you've invested in that meet the definition as it was worded previously.
Yep.
And that got you a certain percentage of your total investments, right? Which is part of what they're looking at for track record, bonus points, and so forth. And why this change is, I think, so important here. And so now, the definition says it applies for calendar year 2024. And so I think there's a little bit of uncertainty. Does that mean the application? So you do have to do your entire track record using that new definition. So now you're going to go get new numbers, or is that really for investments made in 2024? And
Yeah.
so, we, as you mentioned, the working group is going to submit comments. And for those that may be wondering, how you can submit, everyone can submit comments to the CDFI fund. They are going to have a webinar. I believe it's December 17th. However, you have to submit the questions by Sunday, December 1st, which has already happened by the time you've listened to this podcast. So hopefully everyone has seen that kind of deadline for submitting questions. And even if you didn't submit a question, tune into the webinar to see what the fund's response is, because we will have at least submitted that question. So you will get that one answered, hopefully. And I think we're hoping that it's a prospective change, so that you don't have to go back and change all of your data that you've been including in prior applications.
Yeah. And I would say too, you and I, especially just because of what we do with the working group and here at Novogradac, we know every change. If something got capitalized, we know it. So there's a lot of different changes. We saw a couple tables E1 and E2 in capitalization strategy. Those are gone. So now the only table in capitalization strategy is what used to be table E3. Now it's E1, identification of investments and investor commitments. So essentially, if you need investor letters, same, everything the same. But I think one thing that's great, if you're not already part of the working group, one thing that we do for our members is once all of the application documents are released by the fund, we go through all of it, we prepare comparisons, we put things in Word and Excel and make it a little bit more user friendly. And we do a lot of summaries ourselves and then share that with our members. So that way you're not going through all 140, some pages of the application trying to make sure you know what changed. You can kind of go through that, identify the changes and make sure, again, you're not missing a fraction of a point because you didn't update for a change in the application.
Right. And we know how important those points are. And I even heard some of our members say that their membership fee is worth it just for all of these application tools. So I appreciate you pointing those out. But, I know that we could dive into all these details, and I'm sure you will do more of that in the webinar. But this is a record $10 billion round. We've never seen one this large. I have to imagine, though, that that's going to have some impact on how CDEs approach the application this round. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing and what you think some of the implications might be?
Sure, absolutely. I think the first thing is I think we're going to have more applicants. I think oftentimes after we see awards, there are some applicants that plan on taking the next round off. They're just going to focus on deployment and they maybe apply every other round. Some are going to apply every single round no matter what. I think more applicants that have recently received allocation are going to go ahead and apply again just because it's a double round, right? But by no means do I think the number of applicants will double. I just don't think that there's that volume of highly qualified applicants out there. But I think what's great about a $10 million round instead of $5 billion is I think we're going to see more awardees. I think we're going to see a higher award average, larger awards. I also think we're going to see more first time awardees. I think by knowing in advance, CDEs needed to get that certification before the round opened, really force CDEs to be ready. And so I think that also helps. I think if you wait until the application opens to really start thinking about it, you're already starting a little bit behind. I also think one thing that's interesting is every round we have a cap in how much you as an applicant can ask for. So in the more recent rounds, it's been 100 million, but this year it's 120 million. And so I think that's interesting because I think a lot of CDEs that normally ask for the max, they're just going to ask for the new max, 120 million. That means that CDEs will most likely need more pipeline projects to, meet that allocation request, and support more allocation. So I think it's a great opportunity for those projects out there that are looking to find allocation. I think CDEs are going to be looking for more deals and be interested. But yeah, I think it'll be interesting.
On the notion of larger award sizes and this higher cap, right? 120 million versus 100 million. In prior rounds, they've had 100 million for a while now, and typically the highest award has been somewhere around $65 million. So they aren't making, even though they have a cap, they aren't making awards to that cap, right?
Yep.
And so, but as you said, I agree. I think that the award size will be larger. I don't think it'll be 120 million, but I do think it'll be larger. Um, do you think larger awards will lead cities to try to find projects that they can make larger investments in, so use more of their allocation? Or do you think that they're going to find more projects, right? Or it's probably, or maybe some combination of the two?
Yeah, I think that a lot of CDEs are thinking about their strategy around this. For some, I think they want to keep a similar deployment strategy as they've had in the past. And so they might be looking to deploy more allocation to kind of maybe a similar number of projects. And so they might be looking, maybe they're only going to be a CDE in some transactions instead of a multi CDE transaction. Where others, I think they might just plan on keeping the same strategy as they have, but just doing more transactions, and maybe kind of planning internally to either, refocus some internal resources or perhaps plan on it taking a little bit longer. Maybe they normally deploy in 18 months. Now they're thinking 24 months. But I think that's also important for CDEs to think about. Don't just go and ask for all of this allocation, say it's going to take you 5 years to deploy, right? The CDFI fund is not going to like that answer. At least I don't think they're going to like that answer. And so I would look to see what can you get deployed in 2 to 3 years at the most. And that may help you decide what allocation request makes sense for you. I think for most, whatever they ask for, they probably don't quite get there. They get a little bit less if they're lucky enough to get an award. But I think there's a lot going into deciding what size of allocation request to make.
Going back to the cap, do you see more CDEs requesting the up to the limit, or do you see them requesting something less than the limit?
Sure. I think that if you look at some of the larger, maybe national CDEs, they typically ask for the max. They've got a very substantial track record. They typically have a pretty robust pipeline. So I think if they've asked for the max in the past, I think they're probably going to ask for the max again this coming round.
Yeah, I do.
But what we've noticed over probably the last 10 years is if you look at the actual allocation requested, you've seen that kind of go down, not because people aren't as interested, but because folks realize no one's getting the 100 million max, right? The average is right around like 50. So they look and decide, what really makes sense. Now, certainly, I think almost every applicant I've ever worked with says, however much you give me, I can deploy, right? You give me 100, I got it, no problem. But they just realize they're probably not going to get that. And so I see a lot more applicants asking for less, but getting closer to what they're actually asking for. And I think that's been really helpful. I think the CDFI fund sees that from CDEs and says, okay, we think you really have a good plan. You can actually get the allocation out the door quickly and to great projects. And that's what they want to see.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's always interesting because I can see the argument both ways, right? Go ahead and just ask for as much as they're going to let you ask for, or do I be more conservative and ask what I think that they would give me, right? And so
Yep. Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
All, I would say this is your chance. If you want to bump
Right.
up that request a little bit, now's your moment.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. Now, Rebecca, I'm going to preview with you some polling questions that I'm going to post on the New Market Tax Credit Working Group's LinkedIn page starting December 2nd in the lead up to our conference in San Diego to get your insight, to allow you to make guesses so that it's not just me up here making all these guesses. Although I will take credit for guessing mid-November for when the application would come out. So I did say that, but I have 6 questions for you. All right.
Okay.
So we'll do rapid fire. How many applications will be submitted in this $10 billion round? There were 196 in the last round. What is your guess for this time around?
215.
215. Okay. I think, I was somewhere that's interesting. That's actually lower than where I was because before they had the CDE certification deadline as a requirement to apply before the NOAA, it had to be certified as of the NOAA day. I thought it was going to be a lot more because I thought a lot of people would hear 10 billion and rush in and try to submit applications. But when they limited it to only certified CDEs, I agree. I think it's going to be less. I was kind of around the 230 range. So it'll be interesting to see if it's
Yeah.
an increase of 20 to 30 to 40 applications.
Yeah.
Now, next one is how many awards do you think will be made in the $10 billion round? There were 104 in the last round, which, was an average award size of $48 million. What do you think? How many awards do you think it'll be this time around?
I'm going to guess 140. I really think there's going to be a lot of very highly qualified applicants there. So I think with more allocation, they can kind of go deeper into that list. So that's my guess. What about you?
Yeah, I think that that's right. I think that I think that it's somewhere between probably 140 to 155 if I had to guess. When you look at the kind of scoring distribution from the last round, and you look at the applications that had a score from 104 to 110. So, an applicant that lost no more than 6 points. You saw about 130 or so that fit within that scoring range. So I think that, with an increase in number of applicants, I think you will see more that probably fit in those buckets. So I think, 140 to 150 probably sounds about right when you're trying to look at, some of this data and what has happened in the past.
Yeah.
Now, of those, 130, 140 awards, how many do you think will be first time awardees? There were only
I-
3
yeah.
in the last round.
There are only 3, which is just so crazy.
Right.
I think we're going to see an increase.
Yeah.
I know there's been new applicants in there. Some have tried a couple rounds. I'm going to go crazy and I'm going to say 7. I don't know if it can go that high. Maybe it's 5. I don't know. I want to see more that can participate for sure. It's just hard to get it.
Yeah, I think I think that that's pretty reasonable. I was gonna say probably I think there might be somewhere between 11 to 15 actually. I
Wow.
think
Yeah.
that if I recall correctly, um, I think in the $7 billion combined round, I think there were 12. If I remember correctly, but since then the number of first time awardees has gone way down,
Right.
in the single digits for the last several rounds. And so which is just a testament to how competitive, but it's also probably very welcome for a lot of applicants who've never received to see a $10 billion round, to feel like
Yeah.
there's actually now an opportunity that, they could be successful for the first time. So I'm
Yeah.
hopeful for all of those, that there is an increase. But we'll see.
Yeah. No,
Uh,
I think you're right because there were 13 in the previous double round, which was only 7 billion,
right.
but they didn't make announcements in advance that it was going to be a double round. So after everyone submitted the 2015
Right.
applications, then they said, oh, it's going to be a double round.
Yeah.
But then ever since then, it's been like 3 or 5 or 6. 1 year we had 9.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I think a lot of it really is just that barrier to entry. You've got to come in with just such a
Yeah.
strong application. It's hard.
Yeah. No, for sure. What is it about average award size? I forget how many you said you were predicting. So what does that number equal in terms of average award size?
I was thinking maybe somewhere around 60 million. I
Okay.
think it'll be interesting to see how the awards kind of fall, but I think
Right.
we're right around 50 right now, so I could see 60 being a good average.
Yeah. I'm I'm predicting maybe 65 to 70.
Mhm.
I think that they will go a little bit larger. Um, Part of me wonders if it's just they don't have to make as many awards.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, I'm kind of, definitely an increase, whether it's 20%, 30, 40%. I don't, it's hard to say, but I definitely think that it's going to be more, as we said, it's not going to be double the number of awards, and it's not going to be double the average award size. It's going to be somewhere in between. So I definitely agree. It'll be an increase. The last round, the largest award size, as I mentioned, was 65 million. What's your guess for this round, the $10 billion round?
Gonna go 90 million. I think that kind of is somewhat in line with the increase in the cap. I don't think they're gonna go all the way up to 100, but I mean, it
Right.
wouldn't be completely unreasonable for someone to get 100.
Yeah, I could have tried to, read into everything. So they increased the cap by 20%. So does that mean they're going to increase the largest award size from, 65 to, you know, 80 million? I probably more in line with you. That's probably closer to the, is 80, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see where they land. Um, and then last question, and maybe the too early to tell, or too early to guess, is when do you think the awards will be announced next year, or do you even think it will be next year?
I really do think it could be fall. Right now it says fall on the website.
Right.
I really think that awards were ready earlier this year, but they had to wait for changes in the application and things like that. Just the timing didn't quite work. So, because of our work, we know right when the seasons change. And so my guess is September 23rd. That's when we're going to get an award announcement.
All right. So what is that? Is that a day later than it was this year?
I
Or
think so.
I think, or maybe
That's how many
no, it's
we've
like
been
maybe it
through
was like
all
a
those
couple days
extra
later.
apps.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Because it was the what? I think it was the 19th this
I
year.
think it was the 19th.
Yeah. So you're going a couple days. You know, I think that they're going to take a longer time. I'm convinced that with all of the apps that we're helping with, there's going to be so many highly qualified applications,
Yeah.
and they're going to have hard time getting through it. So I think they're going to be later in the year. I think that they're probably going to be mid to late October before they get awards out. I just think that they're going to need the extra time because, as you know, phase one has the outside reviewers that we talked about. And it's
Yeah.
really when they go into phase two where they have to do a lot of due diligence.
Yeah.
And so I think that the due diligence is what could maybe slow things down a little bit. Uh,
Yeah.
and so that's
Because
what I'm going to go
we are
later.
thinking that we're going to see more applicants. And I really think we're going to see a lot of highly qualified applicants. So it's not going to be a lot of applications that aren't even close. And
Right.
so I agree. I think the phase one of the review process, now they're going to have to go through more applications. So we're both thinking well over 200, where in the past it's been, like 196, 197, right around there for a while.
Right.
Uh, and then you're right. Once they move to phase two, now they have to do all the due diligence as well. So
Right.
I'll be more positive and hopeful, but I mean, I agree. I think October or November is certainly, open for possibilities.
Yeah, one thing we've definitely have been seeing is a concerted effort, and we should applaud them. The CDFI fund trying to get things, processed more quickly. And
Yep.
I think that everyone in the industry is appreciative of that because being able to have a more consistent timetable for this process, I think is makes it a little bit easier for everybody to figure out what their business plan is going to be for a year. All right. Well, good. That was fun. I appreciate you letting me send those out to you in rapid fire fashion. But as we mentioned before, we've talked a lot about the application itself, but you have these CDEs out there that are actually working on applications. And I know that Rebecca, you work with a lot of CDEs and help them with their application. What are you telling your CDE clients to be doing now? How are you
Sure.
helping them?
Well, if you're not working with me, then I would say you need to go ahead and get started on your application if you haven't already. Make sure you get that application registration done this week. Absolutely critical. I think one of the biggest things my clients are focusing on right now is compiling and finalizing their pipeline. It's my recommendation that they finalize their pipeline about a month before the deadline. So that gives plenty of time. If you run into an issue or a deal falls through or you've got an issue somewhere, you can adjust. Or if you need more information, you're not, rushing there at the end. You got to be organized. You've got to take your time. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Let me ask you real quick about that. How much pipeline are you recommending typically?
So that's a really good question. So what the fund wants to see is whatever your allocation request is, that you have a pipeline documented in the application that supports that allocation request. So we always kind of call that your priority pipeline, but that shouldn't be your only pipeline. I normally recommend, if you could double that amount as kind of a secondary pipeline, I think that's really helpful so that when you're talking about pipeline, you can say, here's everything I have. But even if all of this were to fall off or some of these deals aren't going to be available by the time we hit next fall and we've got awards, I still have a really strong and robust pipeline that I'm going to be able to replace any project that might not be ready for financing.
So that's a great, I think, point. And so you have the CDEs that are completing these applications, but as you and I know, the other major stakeholder in all of this are the businesses that want to obtain this subsidized financing. And so, what is your, recommendation or your pro tip to businesses that are, have a project that they believe would be a good candidate for new market tax credit financing during
Yeah.
this application phase? Is there a place for them?
Yeah, I think right now is just one of the best times for a business that's looking for new markets financing because first we just got awards. And so with the QEI threshold requirements and so forth, CDEs are focused on deployment. So you've got the CDEs focused on deployment, but also the CDEs working on their application. So you've got kind of two opportunities right there. And so I'm going to give you homework. If you're a business looking for allocation, what Brad and I normally recommend when we talk to these types of businesses is you need to put a brag sheet together. You got to put information together about your project so you can present that to CDEs. Normally, I would say kind of 1 to 2 pages, but be able to provide additional information as they need it. So what I would say your homework is you need to go into the application and you need to go into that community outcomes section, right? Because we've already said that's one of the two most critical categories that CDEs are focusing on. So the first question is about, the severely distressed areas, deep distress, all of that. Map your project. Just go onto our website, use our free mapping tool, map it, say, what the location is. And if it is meeting any of those severely distressed criteria, list that out. If you put that it's in a deep distress census tract, you're automatically at least going to get a little more attention right now than normal. Then I think go down to those community outcomes, right? There's a whole list of different community outcomes. First three are job related, and go ahead and quantify information based on your project. If you've got a healthcare project, how many patients do you anticipate serving in a year? How many are low income persons or residents of the low income community? Really read those questions, because whatever is being asked there is what CDEs have to put in their application, which means they need that information from you. And if you can't provide that level of detail, they've got to move on to a business that can provide that level in order to be able to complete their application. The other thing that I'll say is, in new markets land, you got to be a social butterfly, right? You don't know who's going to win an award. A lot of times we see deals done with multiple CDEs. And so for a really great deal, I'll see that project in multiple applications, and that's totally fine. So I would say, as you're getting your information together, really share that with as many CDEs that would be able to finance your project, because that's absolutely critical. And then stay in touch. So when they do get an award, they know who you are, they know when you would be ready to close, and they've already got your details about your project. Anything else that you can think of, Brad, that,
I think those are all great tips, and I feel like we could probably keep talking about this for a long time, but I know that you also have a webinar where you're going to talk about this for a long time.
yes.
And you're going to share a lot more tips for how to successfully apply for new market tax credits. So I'm going to save, some of my thoughts for you to share on that, because I know that you will cover them as you always do. Um, and I'll go ahead and include your email address in today's show notes, along with links to some of the key CDFI fund documents that we've talked about. Uh, but before we move on, Rebecca, anything else you want to share?
I think the things to think about are, like I said, it's a marathon, not a sprint. Plan accordingly.
Well, it's
Don't
not a
be.
sprint.
I mean, I feel like
To the
it's
end of
like a
January.
2 months.
Right.
Like, I feel like I'm running at sprint speed the whole time.
Right.
It does feel like that. It's a fast marathon, Brad.
That's right.
But also I would say, plan out your timing accordingly. We've got our conference in San Diego on January 23rd or 24th. So get your application wrapped up. Come to the conference. I think our conferences are really great just because everyone is there. So you get such great networking opportunities. And then definitely, as you were talking about, join our webinar. We're going to be hosting on Wednesday, December 11th. So myself and my fellow partner, Nicola Noli, we're going to be talking all about the application. So if you didn't get enough fun from all of this, definitely join us and we'll really dig into a lot of the details. But then I think, as always, if you've got questions, if you need help, Brad and I help a lot of CDEs with their applications, whether it's just reading or, a little bit more assistance in finding ways to strengthen their applications. Definitely reach out to us and we'd be happy to talk to you.
Yeah, I think I think we've worked long enough together, Rebecca, that I recall back when you got married. I think there was a countdown clock that got passed around our office for
Yeah.
how many more days to the day that you got married. I'm wondering, do you have the same thing for your new market tax credit applications? And Are you counting down the days yet? Enter.
I'm not emotionally ready for that,
Okay.
Brad. At this point, like in my mind, I'm like, it's just later in January.
Okay.
Right now, I have a lot of to-do lists out to my clients of saying, okay, let's do these things. So I'm not mentally ready for that. But it is hard knowing, you really only have about 70 days from
Right.
when the round opens until it's due. So
And
it
you
is.
also have holidays in the middle of all of that.
I know, right?
Right.
It's like how many holidays could we get into this time period?
Right.
But I also think with having the comment period, we had
Right.
two comment periods. So we've seen the application, talked to a lot of clients. I think that really helped. And so at this point, how many years have we now had where the application has been right around this time? So
Right.
I think people are trying to at least maybe take some time off for the holidays, but it's it's going to be a party for sure. I always tell my clients, I'm like, I know you're asking to get to talk to me during the holidays from Santa. That's all you want. So, I guess that looks just great at this year.
Well, I agree with all of that, Rebecca. And for those tuning in, feel free to reach out to Rebecca or myself if you have questions that we can help you with. And I'll be sure that a link to register for the conference as well as your webinar are in today's show notes. Before we move on, let me remind the audience to share the podcast with your colleagues who may be interested. Also, consider leaving a review of the podcast on your platform of choice. We have a full archive of episodes of the podcast available on our website at novoco.com. We also have a large archive of episodes on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. So now let's turn to what's normally called the off mic section, but today I think we're going to call it the pro tip section, Rebecca.
Yep.
And, instead of giving a shout out, I thought that we could change it up a little bit and maybe give one last pro tip before we sign off today. So, Rebecca, what's your pro tip?
So mine kind of touches on something that I talked about a little bit earlier when you're looking at pipeline. Remember, I was like, I really want you to finalize that a month before because if something happens, you've got time. What I would say is as you're getting all of the data for your track record deals and pipeline deal, make sure you're calculating your metrics as you're going through that process because one of the requirements in question 26A is you've got to use third-party metrics, right? So you need to calculate, temporary jobs per construction costs or students served per square foot, whatever you use, right? But go ahead and be looking at that as you're working. So if you have an outlier, you can go ahead and reach out to your project sponsor and get a little bit more detailed. I think it's fine if you've got an outlier and you can explain it, but you don't want to be the day before the application's due trying to make metrics work. That's bad. And I've seen folks struggle with that before. So that's my pro tip. Don't wait till the end. Just be thinking about that now, even though you may not want to.
And maybe to take that pro tip a little bit further, since your pro tip was focused on CDEs, I would say that there's a similar pro tip for a business to hear what Rebecca just said and go, she already told me I need to be able to provide this type of information that's in question 26 in the application in terms of the community outcomes that my project is going to deliver. Why don't I just go ahead and make it easier for the CDE and tell them how I calculated that amount and give them the information that says, I didn't just make this up one day, that there's actually support for this. And as you mentioned, the metrics, knowing what, metrics are and,
Yes.
third party, like, can you actually say, I'm, estimating 100 jobs and that's based upon this? I think that would be tremendously helpful to CDEs as they're looking at your project that, determining whether or not it should be included or not in your application. So I really like that pro tip, Rebecca. Mine, I actually have two. I came up with a second one while we were doing the podcast. So my first one was that in the application, I think there are places where sometimes less is more. And I know that that's hard because we don't know where every single point is. They don't tell you, right? And naturally, I think it's everyone's, inclination. It's like, I got to say yes to everything in the application. But I think, having done this enough times, we've all learned that sometimes checking every box can actually be to the detriment of your application. The CDFI fund, there are certain questions that they only will score you based upon what you put. And so if you can't put something, a response that is a excellent response, and you think that if I just check it, I'm checking more things. Yeah, but you're checking more things and adding things that aren't that great. And so their only option is to give you a lower score because you gave them something that wasn't excellent. And so I think that, I've learned over time that, sometimes less is more there, but also make it easy to read too. Just because it says it's 5,000 or 10,000 characters or whatever it may be, if you're putting a lot of stuff in there and you're repeating yourself and you're not getting to the point, not being concise, I think that, that can be difficult for a reader who's reading a lot of applications. And so you want to make it easy for them to read as well. And my second pro tip is the new market tax credit mapping tool that we mentioned, right? If you haven't done it already, you can click on it, go through your browser on your phone, and then save it to your home screen on your phone. And that way you will have what looks like an app essentially for the new market tax credit mapping tool, so that no matter where you are and you want to map something, it's right there and you can click on it just like you do any of your other apps on your phone. So that's my second pro tip for today. So, well, Rebecca, I appreciate everything. It was an honor to be able to be a guest host today with you. We've worked so long together. It's always fun to have these kinds of conversations. So thank you for being on the podcast today. And to our audience, as I promised, Mike Novogradac will be back next week. But for now, I'm Brad Elphick, and thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac and Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.